No, I don't think there are any characters in there who are wholly good or wholly evil. Just as I don't think there are any people in the world who are wholly good or wholly evil. It's often said Hitler loved dogs and was very kind to animals. Human beings are complex people. I've read a lot of history, and it's amazing the things that you find out about people. I mean, people who we think of as heroes who did terrible things in their life, people who we think of as villains who had moments of compassion or kindness, or who had people who loved them. Um, I think all of us have it in us to be angels, and all of us have it in us to be monsters. There's a lot of fantasy that concerns itself with the battle of good and evil. And I think the battle of good and evil is a terrific subject for fiction. But I don't think it's fought between really good-looking guys in white cloaks on white horses and really ugly guys in black armor who smell bad, as in too much fantasy. I think it's fought within the individual human heart. I've always been attracted to gray characters. That's what I try to write, because I think those are real characters. Those are real human beings. You know, I've always taken as my mantra William Faulkner's words in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he said, the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. I think that's true of all fiction, of literary fiction, such as Faulkner wrote, but also of science fiction and fantasy and historical novels and nurse novels and whatever. I mean, if you have real characters grappling with real problems, the human heart in conflict with itself, doesn't matter if it's in a castle or a spaceship or whatever. If you have that, then you have power, and if you don't, then you don't. And
I mean, my fantasy series, of course, is often compared to Tolkien, and I've talked in many interviews about and I love Tolkien. I'm the biggest fan in the world of Lord of the Rings, but
Me too. Yeah.
Tolkien's view of good and evil in that is evil is externalized. It comes from Sauron or Morgoth before it, and there are orcs who are absolutely irredeemable, and the good people get together and stop the orcs, and most of the good people are good. I've always been more attracted to gray characters, and I've said in many interviews, well, I do think the battle of good and evil is a great subject for fiction, but in my view, the battle for good and evil is waged within the individual human heart, and it's our decisions. We're all partly good and partly evil, and we make decisions every day, and we may do a good thing on Wednesday and then an evil thing on Thursday, or a selfish thing, and it's all very complicated, and that's kind of the approach that I've taken.
One of the things that sets George Martin's fantasy world apart from other writers is its moral complexity.
You are no knight. You have forsaken every vow you ever took.
So many vows. They make you swear and swear. Defend the king, obey the king. Obey your father. Protect the innocent, defend the weak. And what if your father despises the king? What if the king massacres the innocent? It's too much. No matter what you do, you're forsaking one vow or another.
No, I think you have to take your characters and you have to put them through crises. That's what fiction and drama is all about. Is not your hero has a really good time, but things have to happen that cause the characters to question who they are and what their place in the world is and what the meaning of it all is. To go through the dark nights of the soul and times of fear and terror and all of this. And Jamie losing a hand, losing the very thing that he defined himself on is crucial to, I think, where I want to go with the character. And question is, what do you make of yourself after you've lost that? And of course, I have Tyrion now going through similar things. I mean, he's always focused on the things that he he did not have, like his father's respect or admiration, or, perhaps women didn't look on him the way he would have liked them to look on him, and all of that stuff. But in the aftermath of the events of the recent books, he's now realizing the things that he did have that he's now lost, like the Lannister name and a vast fortune in gold that could allow him to buy and sell anything. He's been reduced to the most primal, difficult situation where he has nothing but the clothes on his back, and even those don't belong to him, and his wits, his tongue. So yeah, that's what drama comes out of. I love exploring that stuff. Well, I've always had a certain attraction to cripples, bastards, and broken things. And yes, there are a great number of the viewpoint characters, in particular, Game of Thrones, who are suffering under one handicap or another. Tyrion is a dwarf, and of course the women are reacting against the roles expected for their sex in a medieval society, in the society of Westeros. Jon Snow is a bastard. Sam is fat and is not the kind of ideal
Craven.
lord that people, want for that time. So there's a lot of people, and a brand gets paralyzed. I find these characters with problems interesting.
On horseback, you'll be as tall as any of them.
Is this some kind of trick? Why do you want to help him?
I have a tender spot in my heart for cripples, bastards, and broken things.
I think the one thing that unites all of these people, as different as they may be in terms of age and sex and religious faith and whatever, is that they all are basically human beings. I write some characters who are like me, although none of them are precisely like me, because I was not born into a medieval feudal society. I write characters who are, on the surface at least, very unlike me. But in every case, for the motivating emotional power, I have to look inward. I think all writers do that. The only person we ever truly know is ourselves, and our hopes, our dreams, our fears, the things that haunt us at night. So I think you need empathy, and you need to remember that as different types of people may be, we're all share a common humanity and are not ultimately that different from each other.
Do you like killing your characters?
No, I don't.
Then
But
why do you do it so
I do-
much, George?
I do think it needs to be done.
Big fan of death up there, okay.
Valor Morgulis, all men must die. I think it's part of life, and art needs to reflect life. Particularly if you're writing a fantasy novel, an epic fantasy novel. Certainly since the days of Tolkien, so many fantasy novels have been about war. I mean, there's a war at the center of Lord of the Rings. The Sauron and his great armies of orcs and Southlings and Easterlings and other lings are all moving out, and the free men of the West are fighting against them. And of course, in my books, there's a considerably more complicated war going on. But you look at all of the other writers who've been in between, and there's wars and wars and wars. Now, I'm not saying you have to write about war. There are many other interesting things to write about, and I've written about some of them. I don't have a war in all my books, but if I'm going to write about war, if any writer is going to write about war, then I want him to treat war honestly. And one thing I know about war from people who served in Vietnam and served in other wars is, it does bring out the beast in men, and anybody can die. It doesn't matter if you're the hero. I think everybody who died in any war thought they were the hero right till the moment that the bullet blew off the top of their skull. So it irritates me when I'm watching a movie or reading a book, and the hero is going through incredible dangers, him and his 6 buddies, and none of them die. You know, maybe one of them gets wounded at some point, but they all survive pretty much untouched at the end. I mean, and Tolkien, which I read when I was young and at a pretty formative age, I think. That book had an immense influence on me. And it does have some powerful deaths in it. The death of Boromir it still resonates with me. That was a powerful moment. The death of Gandalf in the Mines of Moria, when the Balrog drags him down to the thing, and he says, "Fly, you fools!" And that's enormously powerful because you know, especially at that point in the book, because Gandalf is the father figure. Gandalf is the guy who has the answers. Gandalf is the one who knows what they should do and how they should do it. And suddenly he's gone, and now the hobbits are on their own with Strider and Boromir and people they don't necessarily trust because their relationships are still fairly new at that point, and they're facing untold dangers, and they don't have Gandalf to warn them of exactly what's around the next turn in the bend. That's a hugely powerful moment, which I actually, if it had been me, Gandalf would have stayed dead. I think bringing him back is surprising, but in some ways it undercut the power of that moment. And by setting up those moments, Tolkien also set me up for the moment where it seemed like Frodo had died. You know, when I'm reading the end of the Two Towers and Shelob stabs him and he seems to be dead, and Sam takes the ring, and then the book is over. You know, and you have to wait for the next book. I really thought Frodo was dead. I thought Tolkien had earned his stripes with me. He had killed Boromir. He had killed Fred, and now he killed Frodo. My God, I really don't know what's going to happen in this book. Anyone can die. And it became so much more exciting in that point because anyone could die. The peril was real. And that's the feeling I want my readers to have, that if you're going to enter...
Fear is the feeling you want your readers to have. Yeah.
Yes, actually. In a word, if you're going to write about fearful situations, I want you to have fear, and the right kind of fear. I mean, we go on roller coaster rides, and we're scared, right? That roller coaster rides are scary, supposedly, but we're not really scared. We know that we're going to get off the roller coaster after 3 minutes, and however high we go, and then we plunge down, and there's a certain thrill and I guess an adrenaline rush or something like that. So we like to be scared in certain senses, but that's one kind of fear. But there's another kind of fear that you feel when, like, you're all alone and you're walking in a bad neighborhood, and suddenly you hear footsteps behind you, and you turn and you see some people coming, and you don't know who the hell they are, and you know that's a moment. Or a moment that a soldier or a policeman or anyone fears when they're in a situation where their life is on the line. I mean, that's a much more visceral kind of fear, and that's the kind of fear I want the reader to feel. I mean, I think writing is about strong emotions. I want you to be afraid when I'm putting the characters in a scary situation. When a character dies, I want you to grieve for that character as you would for a friend or a loved one or a parent, and this entire, vicarious experience, which is my goal as a writer. I want you, if I'm going to describe a feast, I don't want to just say yes, and then they ate a feast.
It was delicious.
I wanted you to smell the food and taste the food, whether it's delicious food or bad food or whatever. Smell the particular things. If it's a joust, I want you to have the excitement of getting caught up in who's going to win the joust. If it's a sex scene, I want you to get hot and bothered. Or I want you not just to read my work, but to live my work. That's a quote I said a couple years ago about a reader. A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one. But I've always felt that. I think reading is about vicarious experience.
Game of Thrones is set during a bloody civil war, and it portrays war in all its brutality.
Epic fantasy is universally about wars. I mean, Tolkien, and even before Tolkien, E.R. Edison. The heart of epic fantasy always seems to be some great war or another. And to some extent, I think I'm in dialogue as I write about war with other fantasists who have gone before me and even my contemporaries.
But unlike most writers of epic fantasy, Martin depicts war as horrific and largely futile, rather than heroic.
It's a complicated issue here. I'm not a complete pacifist. If you believe in war under any circumstances, then you have to say you'd fight in World War II. Come on, the Nazis were the closest thing that the human race has ever reached to orcs. If the Nazis had not existed and we invented them for a fantasy novel, people would say, "Oh, come on, you're going over the top. This is ridiculous." You know, they're cooking people in ovens. They wear all black uniforms. They have skulls on their hats. Come on, this is too much. But that's the reality of the situation. But if you look past World War II, I mean, look at World War I. My God, what a colossal waste of millions of human lives. What was World War I all about? Why did anyone fight in World War I? You know, why did anyone fight in the War of Jenkins' Ear, the War of the Three Henrys?
You'd have us surrender. End all this bloodshed, I understand. But the country would be at peace, and life would be just under the righteous hand of good King Joffrey.
You're going to kill Joffrey?
The gods give me strength.
And then what?
I don't know. We'll go back to Winterfell. I have no desire to sit in the Iron Throne.
So who will?
I don't know.
You're fighting to overthrow a king, and yet you have no plan for what comes after.
First, we have to win the war.
You go back and you look at these thousands of years of wars and what caused them, and, you know, most of the time it just doesn't seem worth it.
He had to rethink his worldview.
I'd come from Bayonne, and, you know, Bayonne was blue-collar and very patriotic, and, you know, the United States can do no wrong, and et cetera. But college was an education for me. I remember being assigned to do a paper to research the Vietnam War, which before that I had just thought about, well, we're in another war and we're helping poor people defend themselves against evil communist aggression. And then I actually researched the war and the role of the French and, you know, the complexity and the rigged elections, and, you know, suddenly it didn't look at all so clear-cut to me anymore. And I gradually got radicalized, I suppose you would say.
While still a student, George sold his first story, which appeared in the science fiction magazine Galaxy in 1971. The hero is a tale of a battle-weary soldier fighting on a distant planet who wants to retire and return to Earth.
That was definitely an anti-war story and an anti-militarization story. It was actually triggered by people coming back from Vietnam, particularly Green Berets and all that, who'd been trained to respond violently to any kind of threat, and they had a hard time turning this off in civilian life. Well, what if you have someone who's a soldier like that in the future, and he's this killing machine, he's this highly decorated killing machine, and now he wants to go back to civilian life. How do you make him not a killing machine? A couple years later, when I was called up to be drafted, I applied for conscientious objector status. One of the supporting documents I submitted was that story, which was like a couple years before, so it clearly showed anti-military and anti-war sentiments, 2 years before my application, and perhaps gave my application a little more credence, so my draft board did give me conscientious objector status.
Despite taking an anti-war stance over Vietnam, George Martin has constantly returned to warfare as a theme in his fiction.
War is an important subject. It's there. It's all through human history. I mean, you go back and you read history. I've studied history all my life. I've read history. What is history? History is war. History is the history of war. The Romans versus the Carthaginians, the Greeks versus the Persians, the wars of the Italian city-states during the Renaissance, the 100 Years' War, the American Revolution, the British Revolution, the French Revolution. It's all
wars and violence. It's the most important subject.
Look at me. Stannis is a killer. The Lannisters are killers. Your father was a killer. Your brother is a killer. Your sons will be killers someday. The world is built by killers. So you better get used to looking at them.
It's not enough to be a good man to be an effective ruler, and it never has been. You know, if it has been, you know, Jimmy Carter would be the greatest president of the 20th century. I mean, he's clearly, I think, the best human being to be president in my lifetime, but he was not a particularly effective president for all his decency and his humanity and his compassion and his undoubted intelligence. I mean, the man was a nuclear engineer in a Navy, but nonetheless, he failed at it. And there are some examples of medieval kings in history who were terrible human beings, but they were nonetheless very good kings for their country. So it's complicated and it's hard. And I wanted to show not just with the women, but you know, you see in my books repeated examples of both kings and the hand of the king, the prime minister, if you would, trying to rule, and whether it be Ned Stark or Tyrion Lannister or Tywin Lannister or you know, Daenerys Targaryen in the latest book, Cersei Lannister in the book before that, and trying to deal with some of the real challenges that affect anyone trying to rule the Seven Kingdoms or even a city like Marine. And it's hard. You know, we can all read these books or look at history and say, oh, so-and-so was stupid. They made a lot of mistakes. Look at all these stupid mistakes they make. But these kind of mistakes are always much more apparent in hindsight than when you're actually kind of faced with the decision about, my God, what would I do in this situation? How do I resolve the thing? Do I do the moral thing, but what about the political consequences of the moral thing? Do I do the pragmatic, cynical thing and just kind of screw the people who are screwed by it? I mean, it's hard, and I want to get to all of that, and be it a male ruler or a woman's ruler. Well, what constitutes a good king? You know, to what extent do you want to be harsh with your people? To what extent do you want to be merciful? Where does justice come into it? You know, Machiavelli had his views, Hobbes had his views. I mean, this is a fascinating debate, and one that's just as timely in 2015 as it is in 1315.
I've got 7 kingdoms to rule. 1 king, 7 kingdoms. Do you think honor keeps them in line? Do you think it's honor that's keeping the peace? It's fear. Fear and blood.